The war that began with banners flying and songs of glory has become something darker, something bloodier. Across the divided nation, young men in blue and gray marched to a fate none of them can yet imagine. For 2 days in April of 1862, two armies would clash in and around the area called Pittsburg Landing. When the smoke settles and the guns go silent, nearly 24,000 casualties would litter the forests and fields near Pittsburg Landing. This battle changed things. It ended any hopes of a quick and bloodless war. Before Antietam, before Gettysburg, there was Shiloh, and it begins now. In the Western Theater, General Ulysses S. Grant, fresh from victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, began pushing deeper into the Confederate heartland. By mid-March, Union troops had reached the small town of Savannah, Tennessee. Grant's army camped at Pittsburg Landing, where it spent time drilling recruits and waiting for reinforcements from Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio. Grant was ordered not to engage the Confederate forces until he had been reinforced by Buell's army, who was marching overland from Nashville to meet him. Once combined, these two armies would advance on Corinth, which was 22 miles south of Grant's current position. The town of Corinth had strategic value because it was the intersection of two major railroads, including one that was part of a rail network used to move Confederate forces and supplies from the East Coast to the Western Theater. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston consolidated his forces at Corinth and began making preparations against Grant. Johnston's 44,000-man Army of the Mississippi was composed of 4 Army Corps commanded by Major General Leonidas Polk, Braxton Bragg, William Hardee, and John C. Breckinridge. Instead of waiting to be attacked by a larger force, Johnston planned to surprise Grant's army at Pittsburg Landing before Buell could join him. Johnston placed his troops in motion on April 3rd, but heavy rains delayed his attack. By nightfall on April 5th, his army was deployed for battle only a few miles away from the southernmost Union camps. One of these camps was home to a division under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss. On the night of April 5th, men from the 12th Michigan tried to warn Prentiss that there was a Confederate army on his doorstep. Like many high-ranking Union officers, Prentiss was not worried and disregarded these reports. Colonel Everett Peabody, one of Prentiss's 2 brigade commanders, took these reports seriously and vowed he would not be taken by surprise. Peabody would order Major James Powell of the 25th Missouri to lead a patrol to find these Confederate troops.
They shall not surprise us. There is but one thing for me to do, that is, to send a small force out and attack them, and so give the alarm to our army. Colonel Everett Peabody.
You and I are soldiers in the 25th Missouri Infantry, and we were sent out on a reconnaissance mission to locate Confederate forces. Suddenly, shots ring out. Are these the opening shots to a major battle, or would this be another enemy encounter dismissed by high command? Let's find out. At approximately 3 a.m. on April 6 of 1862, Major James Powell and a combined force of nearly 400 men from the 25th Missouri and the 12th Michigan began making their way into the pitch black, having only the stars to guide them. This patrol would begin making their way down an old wagon trail that today is known as Reconnoitering Road. Colonel Everett Peabody would send a messenger to locate Brigadier General Prentiss, but he could not be located. The division commander had no idea that this patrol was sent out. Now we are on Reconnoitering Road, and for whatever reason that word is extremely hard for me to say, so I'm glad I was just able to pronounce it. But Major James Powell's recon force was coming directly at us on the camera, moving in this direction here. Now they would come to this area here, and the field before us here is called Fraley Field. And once they reached this area, they surprised a handful of Confederate pickets, and those surprised Confederate forces fired 3 shots and then pulled back. And give you a better view of the field here. So what you're seeing is Say Field here. And once they reached this general area, you had 3 shots fired, most likely from that wood line, directly at the Union forces here, and they would pull back. Now, Powell's forces were originally organized into 3 columns. You had a column of Union troops coming right down Reconnoitering Road. You had another column to their left, and then you had another column to their right. And once these shots were fired, Powell would organize his men in a more traditional skirmish formation, representing a longer linear line. And he would begin advancing them into Fraley Field. Now, remember, this is early in the morning, hours before sunlight. It's pitch black, and there was almost a friendly fire incident among Powell's patrol. Like we mentioned, there were 3 columns, and one of the columns almost fired into their adjacent column. Luckily, that didn't happen. Now, Peabody sent this patrol out without the knowledge of his superiors, and he is going to face some backlash for that. But if Union troops fired and killed each other on this patrol, could you imagine how much more backlash Peabody would have experienced? It's one of those great what-ifs of history, but luckily for the Union patrol, they didn't fire on each other and they continued on their mission into Fraley Field. So we're continuing our trek towards Fraley Field. But just to keep you oriented, that's Say Field, and the Union patrol is moving in this direction. Now, we mentioned that 3 shots were fired at the Union patrol by Confederate pickets. They would retreat down this direction here. That is the Old Corinth Road. And Major James Powell's patrol would arrive in this general area, moving in this direction at approximately 4:55 a.m. on the morning of April 6th, 1862, and they would continue in this direction. Now keep in mind, we are now in our skirmish formations advancing. Just imagine, remember, it is pitch black out. You're a Union soldier, you've never seen combat before. Think about how nervous you are. There was almost a friendly fire incident, and luckily there wasn't, but now we're advancing and we're approaching Fraley Field here, and you could almost make out a few shadows in the distance here. Are those friends or those foes? We're about to find out. So before you is Fraley Field. Now, at the time of the battle, this area was owned by James Fraley. This was a 40-acre field of cotton, and Powell's men would advance in this general direction, and they would encounter 2 Confederate picket posts who would quickly fire some volleys at the advancing Union skirmishers, and they would pull back. And they were pulling back to a skirmish line that was manned to the 3rd Mississippi Battalion under the command of Major Aaron Hardcastle. Now, we mentioned Powell was an experienced Army officer before the war, and so was Hardcastle. So now you had 2 very experienced officers who knew how to operate in combat, squaring off against each other in the early morning hours of April 6th, 1862, and the first shots of Shiloh were fired in this field before us here. Now, Powell's men, once they were fired on by that Confederate picket post at 4:55, which were the first shots of the Battle of Shiloh here, he would advance his skirmishers to about halfway into Fraley Field here. And we got a small obstacle in front of us, but we're going to continue and see this battle through their eyes. Now, Powell's men would pursue about halfway into Fraley Field, and now a 1-hour gunfight would ensue between these 2 forces. You know, remember, it's dark. We're using the muzzle flashes to try and locate the enemy. You see a flash in the distance, you point your musket, you squeeze off your round. Now, the enemy knows where you are. So this fight here lasted about an hour, and both sides are taking casualties. Now, when you compare the casualties to the rest of the battle, they're relatively light, but don't make light of the handful of men that were killed in this field. I believe Hardcastle lost 4 killed and had a couple dozen wounded, and I couldn't really find a number for Powell's men, but I would imagine it was very similar. So we have a 1-hour gunfight ensuing here in this field. Now, let's hop over to the Confederate line and see this battle from their perspective. All right, so now we're seeing this battle from the Confederate perspective here. Now, way off in the distance, that's where the Union forces would emerge. They would advance about halfway into the field, and we are at the position of the 3rd Mississippi Battalion. Now, there's their position here, and I'll show you that sign here shortly, but I don't want to film directly into the sun. So here we're in the position of Hardcastle's men, kneeling down, firing at this Union patrol. And like I said, this is a stand-up fight for about an hour. And one thing to consider is the morning stillness was shattered by cracks of musketry here, and both sides were alerted to this. And this fire grabbed the attention of General Benjamin Prentiss, who then rode to Peabody's camp, wondering just what was going on. Now, remember, Colonel Everett Peabody sent this patrol out without the authorization of his superiors, and Peabody was under directions not to bring on a general engagement. So you can imagine the dismay of Major General Benjamin Prentiss when he heard cracks of musketry in the distance.
The enemy opened a heavy fire on us at a distance of about 200 yards, but most passed over us. We returned the fire immediately and kept it up. Major Aaron B. Hardcastle, 3rd Mississippi Battalion.
Now, behind Hardcastle's skirmish line, the entire Confederate army was forming up to attack. And about 6:30 in the morning, you had just thousands and thousands of Confederate infantry lining the wood line here, just behind Hardcastle's skirmish line here. And Major James Powell, who is manning the line in front of us here, he would spot Confederate cavalry on his left flank. So he would pull back his patrol back to Fraley Field. And shortly after that, Hardcastle would break off the skirmish. And Powell also got a glimpse of thousands and thousands of Confederate infantry lining the edge of this field here, forming up for their attack.
Gentlemen, the battle has commenced. It's too late to change our dispositions. Tonight we'll water our horses on the Tennessee. General Albert Sidney Johnston.
So we have moved back to Fraley Field. Now, Fraley Field is a couple hundred yards in this general direction. Now, we mentioned Powell saw a large Confederate force on his left flank, and he caught a glimpse of the Confederate army forming up to launch their first wave attacks here. And he would pull back to Fraley Field, where he would run into Union reinforcements. And there were 5 companies of the 21st Missouri, along with 1 company of the 16th Wisconsin. And these troops were under the command of Colonel David Moore, and they were sent forward by Prentiss to see what's going on and to reinforce the Union troops in this area. Now, Powell would tell Moore what was going on, and Colonel Moore was still a tad dismissive. He still didn't believe a Confederate attack was coming this way until the Arkansas Brigade of Colonel Robert Shaver would emerge from the far wood line here, and now a running fight would ensue in this general area that lasted about 30 minutes. Now, Colonel Moore would get ready to launch a bayonet attack into Shaver's brigade, and just before he disseminated that order, he was wounded in the leg, and Captain Sakes of the 16th Wisconsin would be killed shortly after. So now the Battle of Shiloh is underway. Will the Union be prepared? We're gonna have to see. Now, despite this unauthorized patrol by Colonel Everett Peabody, it succeeded in one major thing. It alerted many of the Union camps in and around this area. And many of the soldiers in these camps now were now preparing for battle. But the question still to ask is, will the Union High Command be ready for this battle?